From Georgina's presentation, because I really love the notion of time, and I have a question for all of you. And how has your approach changed with time, and how has time influenced your work? Sasha, I will start with you, because you were talking about how those microbiomes were developing for a long time.
I think, you hear me? Okay. I think my time is just getting slower and slower, because I live mostly with non-humans and just observing and seeing how they're living. Their time is much slower, so that's how I deal with time. Because I feel it gives me particular freedoms that speed cannot give me. It closes the senses, it closes the body, it just stops certain processes of realization and understanding of the world. So I think all this world building or world meaning that we do as our practices needs that slow time. Otherwise, we're just repeating the same patterns that we saw somewhere else.
Is that working? Yeah. So I would say I've learned a lot about time through materials, because each and every single material has its own timeline and growth speed, and from bacteria to stone, there's so many different time scales in which exist, and they coexist because they live together. So I like to think about time in my practice as life, because these are all part of the living world, and I've understood the living world through the different lifespans that each and every single material has. So through temporality, and everything is temporary, but they have different timelines of temporality. So nothing is ever permanent. So I like the idea of, well, it's getting philosophical here, but I would say if everything is temporary, we need to be more mindful as to how we then integrate that into our lives. So, and work with, create with, and design with. So I think for me, it's finding ways of relating and coexisting in ways that don't feel separate from one another.
Georgina, you recently wrote a book about systems. How do they connect with times and temporally?
So there is part of the book that focuses specifically on time, but I think in terms of thinking about writing and creative practice, and particularly the writing of the book, there's a kind of, I think what I felt like as tunnel time, which is when you go into the tunnel with writing and everything just drops away. It can be quite, it's very intense, but everything is there around you, but it kind of in the tunnel, a lot can get done, but it's also a time of like the absolute focus of it, the kind of exclusion of many other things. But there's also the kind of, I think, which is similar to what you were saying, the kind of, I don't want to call it lazy time, but the kind of time where you've kind of absorbed a lot of information or a lot of material, and then you just have to let it kind of like marinate in your body and in your brain and do nothing with it. And kind of particularly for thinking about how like writing or form or text or whatever will be structured, a lot of that kind of only comes about when you're not, for me, when I'm not thinking about it, when I'm doing things and at other places, and also when I'm not trying to force it. And that's very much in the preparation of it. And I think then the other part of that is the kind of the part where for performance work or the kind of the live work in which it happens so quickly. It's very hard to kind of, however the process is, it goes. But it's also, nothing really exists apart from that moment of the liveness, and then it stops, and then kind of other time resumes again.
A lot of you were talking about symbiosis and collaboration and the need for that, and learning from each other and learning from different species and learning from different environments. Sasha, what would be the lessons you take from this into the everyday life and real world, from your own work?
Well, it would be basically just the first step would be observe and see and feel, taste, work with it. A lot of organisms that I live with, that I then work with and also collaborate with in my installations, live with me for a while before they get there. So it's a process of getting to know and being open to that process, to all the details and delicacies that happen, and that can be applied also in human world. And it's much more inclusive to leave the other person more understanding their own life and just try to collaborate and communicate. So it gives you this kind of openness and inclusivity that maybe it's sometimes difficult to give to people because they're people. But then you go to a non-human world and you learn this and you apply it in human relationships. And that can give you a different kind of community, I think.
One of the questions we get here is, can you tell us more about the method of deep listening and how we can use it in our times? And I think that's very connected.
Yeah, so this is a method, it's basically slowing down, closing your eyes, and letting your mind accept the sounds around you. Listen to all the different details that are there, and just don't ignore any of them. Go with them, like follow them, connect with them, see where it gets you and how it flows around you. It's a very simple method, but if you do it more and more you hear and more you understand. So.
I wish you would be leading some deep listening practice during the break. Sital, if material says something about who we are, what does the omnipresence of plastic say about us?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, it says a lot about human behavior and I would say power dynamics. So knowing that plastics were invented to make our lives more convenient, the human life more convenient, but it doesn't mean that other life it's less convenient for other life. And it was invented during the Industrial Revolution, which was all about globalization and how to make for the whole world and provide, I guess, like a universal solution to the world's problems. And obviously we can see the impacts that it has to our planet. Now, I think there's two sides to this. It's not to demonize plastic, because plastic isn't the issue. It's our behavior towards it and the way that we apply it into our lives. So if we design for plastic to be in spaces which it has longevity, because plastic is a really great caregiver. It preserves so much of our food or whatever it contains. So it's incredible at doing that. Now, the use is for that, because it lasts 500 years, so beyond our lifetime. And that's the way that we need to consider it, rather than thinking, oh, actually, it's going to be used for one use and then thrown away. Now, then it's our own behavior towards it. So I would say the human dominating kind of approach to materials is extract and exploit. That's how we've always kind of worked with materials. And that is a form of colonialism, slavery, and many, many really challenging systemic issues, which continues to exist now. And I would say it's still, I would say the way that we can even include that in the material landscape is of the same nature. So we can't demonize plastic. We need to change our behaviors. And what it says about the world, the question was about the world, I think, yeah. is that we need to give more agency to materials and allow them to guide us to a space where we can start to live with and not dominate. So agency and authorship to materials is what is needed.
I love the quote you had, how we need to be more materialistic, and it's somehow this haptic sense of the world also. Georgina, one question that's getting many likes. What artistic means or forms have you found to function the best to educate or transmit your observations or findings?
Could you repeat that?
Yes, I will read it slowly. What artistic means or forms have you found to function best to educate or transmit your observations and findings?
I'd be curious, I'm not sure if we've got that person in the room, but how function is being, what is meant by function here. I'm going to answer this sideways and then we'll see if we get a follow-up question. If so, great. So I think through communicating, I mean, I'm thinking here both about artistic practice, but also educating as well and through teaching. And one of the many, I mean, there are many approaches here. The experiential one feels crucial to try and get students familiar with the experiential elements of the kind of the complex systems that we are working in, and that can be quite indirect, particularly for large technological systems that are either difficult to access or because they are physically not present. They are immaterial, they are difficult to access because they are politically difficult to access. You can't break into buildings and get a look at server farms. Or they may be very present in everyday life, but not something that has your attention paid to it, which I think comes back to thinking about attention. So kind of the many ways we have for thinking about that is trying to kind of pull out all these different parts of, that similar to that nice diagram that you had earlier of where are these things present and what is their history and how do they exist across these many layers of time, materiality, function as well. How do we assume that these systems are functioning? And to think about how, rather than only mapping things out, because the visual approach can be a really useful tool, but there can often, I think, for complex systems be an expectation that once you have the map of the system, the subway map, the computer chip, that's it. And that map stands in for itself. The map is the territory. But actually, with these things that exist at different timescales, at different kind of forms of scale and presence, even something like the railway system that exists well outside of the human lifespan, well outside of often human control, has rapidly reformed how we think of time, commerce, space, and so on, borders. That thing has a very tangible presence if you travel on it or if you are inhibited by it. So with artistic work and with students as well, with teaching, a lot of the work that we've done is to try and bring those systems to presence somehow and to interrogate them in different ways rather than seeing them as taken for granted things that may well exist beyond human control, in particularly with centralized power, but to try and get a sense of where the kind of the knock-on effects, the spillovers, the layering out into different forms are, and to challenge any, how can I put this? To challenge inbuilt assumptions about them, and to kind of look at where they spill over, particularly into everyday life, to be perfectly honest. The mundane parts of these are often the most present and the most interesting. They're like the tiny little things that we do that we don't really think about until, but they're just part of adapting or living around a larger complex system. Those things, when they're cracked open, they have the world within them to think about.
Mm-hmm. I will open the questions to the audience. I am looking for my favorite architect asking questions, but I'm also looking for others. Thank you. Over there, and then over there.
Hello. Okay. Thanks very much for all the inspiring talks. I would like to ask you more about how to actually listen or understand through materials. And to refer to what Sasha said, that we learn more through cells and experience rather than understanding, I would like to ask you for advice how to be an ally of a non-human participants of our planet, as it always is very hard for me even to be an ally of somebody of a different culture or different experience as a human being. It feels like we should give the floor to them to speak rather than speaking their name. So I wonder, how can we do it when there are materials that don't speak, or nature, you know, like how could we really do it properly so we know it's not anthropocentric, or we don't apply our methods but we give them the chance to express what they need.
Sasha?
So my answer would be, it's like to delve into passionate knowledge mining first and try to get as much information about the particular organism or material, whatever you're interested in, and then cohabitate with it. That's how it is, observation and learning, and then seeing what happens in between. Because this is, you mentioned the word appropriate, and I don't think there is an appropriate way. It's your way and it's my way, because how my body interacts with particular organisms, how I perceive it, how I work with knowledges that I find, it's different than you. You have a different history, different experiences. So just immerse yourself in the experience in every way you think of. You know, maybe you'll find some new ones also. So.
Could I respond? Mine is very simple. I do it through observing and listening, and they're the two methods by which I also relate to other people. And I would maybe even say, first off, try not to other materials by calling them non-human. So I think that is a breaking down of language which needs to happen. And I know we're in this world of human and non-human, but I personally, I'm not a fan of it. So I think it's still a dominating position that humans are placing themselves in. So I think the plant world, there's like insects, there's still, that language is still relevant. And it's the way that it can be interpreted is how we need to understand how to live with one another. And observing and listening are the two main first approaches that I have, but then it goes into all the senses. So even the 5 simple ones, taste, touch, sound, what else is there? The other 2, smell. And I think that is a really great exercise to do, and it's something that I do with many workshops and teaching. And for you to kind of embody something is to really immerse yourself in that, and to do that by those 2 processes is amazing. And there's a really great tool to do the further work is through experimentation, which is called, what is it called? The Verb List by Richard Serra. If you look that up, he gives you a really simple guide of words, which are verbs, rather than nouns. And I think, again, the language thing is what is preventing us from actually getting to know things. So to fold, to bend, to sew, to all of these process-led interactions allows us to get to know one another. And that's what I mean with the material world. So it's a really beautiful, engaging exercise, and you learn so much. And that way you start to understand how versatile each and every single material actually is. And even all the remnants that are left behind, you understand what uses they could potentially have going forward as well. So it's just play,
I will have a follow-up question, and then I will direct it to the girl there. Is there any material, Sital, that fascinates you in that sense?
I'm glad you didn't ask me what my favorite material is. Yes, okay. Maybe I'll pick algae. And this material is fascinating because it exists in pretty much all waters around the world. And it provides the planet's 80% of the planet's oxygen, which is mad. And it's very regenerative and it's life-giving. And it grows in water, so it doesn't occupy extra resources on land. And then it can be fuel, so it can power buildings with energy. It can be textiles, it can be solid surfaces, it can be food for cattle and fertilizer. And algae is also put into dental molds. And then it's just endless what can happen with it. And for me, why it's fascinating is because its immediate reaction when you're in the water is like, ew! So it's slimy, and you kind of are freaked out by it in a lot of places. And I think it's flipping that narrative and actually saying, actually, this material is quite a wonder. And that for me is the flip of that perception is what I really love to do and surprise people.
I love that you're saying, because all the trend reports that I'm reading about the year like 2030 mention algae, and like every industry basically mentions that material, mention that sense. So it's great. So should you want to add? Or? No. Okay, can we get the question? Thank you.
So thanks for the three speakers for very interesting talks. And especially thank you, Georgina. I found your talk really fascinating, and I found it really interesting how you're talking about time and relating that to travels and journey. As part of a project with the team of Sensorium Festival, I investigated the impact of lockdown during the pandemic and how, like, not being able to move and to travel, how that impacted our perception of time. But my question is more, as you opened towards science fiction and kind of fantasies about time. So let's follow up on the dystopian view. What would be worse out of these two fantasies? What would be worse, eliminating time or allowing time travel?
Could you say a little more about, was it elevating time?
No, eliminating.
Eliminating time.
Like no time or limitless time travel?
I mean, I think I will always reject a binary, so I'm going to take both of those ones. I don't think it's possible to eliminate time. Even again, that kind of the thing I found really fascinating and horrifying about the hypersleep thing, the cryopods, is it acts as a kind of like a break in the story, or like the pages get folded and then suddenly we're on Jupiter, or wherever we are. But there's always still the implication that time is still happening there. Like a lot of those stories often happen because something happens when our characters are in a deep sleep. The ship gets an emergency call from another planet which has aliens on it, or the android, the robot that's taking care of the crew while everyone's in sleep, something terrible happens. So there's always this, there's a possibility always that time will be broken even in those places. And that, I think, kind of thinking about it from a kind of like a narrative arc, or a kind of like a narrative device, I think that's really interesting. The infinite time travel is again, I'm going to meet that with another sci-fi story. I'm going to try. It's either Philip K. Dick or Isaac Asimov, and this is terrible that I can't remember which it is. In this story, some scientists, it's always scientists, have managed to invent a device, and the story is written in the 1950s, I think. They've managed to invent a device that allows them to see into the past, and they get really excited because there's one bit of, I think, the Roman Empire, the sackage of Carthage, something has happened. They're just like, with this device that looks like a big screen, we can see the past, and everyone's so excited. It's kind of like time travel. And the story ends in the very distressing manner where one of the scientists realizes that when does the past begin? And the past begins now, and now, and now. So what they've created is not a time-traveling device. What they've created is an eternal, pervasive surveillance device that can always see a fraction of a second into the past or the future. And the story ends, I think, with this scientist marching out of the room. And this is the point where the scientists have also effectively open-sourced this device, and everyone can now build one. And he marches out of the room and he says, happy Goldfish Day, gentlemen, welcome to hell. And it's like, all right, okay. But it's that moment of like where time travel is and isn't, it's now, and it's now, and it's now, and it's now. So that's that part of that kind of those simultaneously livings that feels like it draws attention to time not just being a journey 30 years into the past or a journey 50 years into the future, but it's constant and it's now. And that, I think, for this idea of constant time travel would be what it feels like. Thank you.
Do we have any other question? I will take the one from Slido then. Sasha, how and why did you start your practice with such a strong scientific focus?
I work with soil. I wanted to be grounded. I wanted facts, and then work with facts, and then see from there where it can take me. So I always see my practice as working with facts that is produced from in the scientific field, but then I think of something that Bruno Latour called like concerns around these facts. And how do they enter our society? So when I'm building works, I'm always thinking of how these scientific facts, these organisms, which, a lot of them that I work with are just like new ontologies that we just learned about because technology is progressed and they're coming into the world. And now how are we going to deal with them? What is our ethical stance? How are we going to think of them? And what I found is that it's really important to make stories. With stories and world building, you get them into a place where it's maybe more safe for them if we just let them to a normal extractivist logic and build relationships through stories. So that's why I think of different mythologies that can be made while these new beings are coming into our culture.
And yesterday we talked a lot about the biases and how biases actually reflect the world as we see it. How do they reflect in your own work if you say like, I love facts, I'm fact-based, and at the same time, like the interpretation around it?
Well, also in biological organisms there are a lot of biases. I was actually thinking in a lot of ways how we think about them. A lot of times we use very machinic metaphors. Like yesterday we heard that bees are data sets. But would the bees really be data sets? What are we, and which bees are we talking about? Do we know that these bees that we are breeding are very aggressive bees that live in tribes? But then you have bees that are solitary going around. So like looking at all of these aspects, how we project in some machinic metaphors to the biological world is very important. So there are biases, and there are also biases in the human world, like you have half of the world that is mycophobic and half of the world that is mycophilic. So it's all these things that we have to work through if we want to get to the place of understanding that we were questioned about before. I really liked how the play was mentioned, because I think this kind of experimentation needs to happen in a safe place where we play. We're not supposed to be, observed and demanded some product out of that, but we're supposed to just play and see where the road takes us. We have to have this space of just going with the process. We're talking a lot about processes today, and I think that's the way to do it in a lot of aspects. Yeah.
I find it entertaining how every panel mentions bees at this conference. Every one of them. I'm expecting the last panel to also join the bees. But Sital, we have a question in the Slido. There are many people living in a nomadic way. How does that affect the need for different materials? And I will add on that question. Our way of living has changed and is changing constantly. How that reflects in the material world?
So in a nomadic, but living in a nomadic way. Well, I think materials give you, well, I can even speak from my own experience because I've lived in so many different countries, and my family, I would say, are travelers, and somehow they've ended up in the UK after being kicked out of all the countries that they were colonized by. So living in a nomadic way now is, I think, materials create a sense of belonging. And whatever you bring with you gives you what's the phrase, William Morris? Oh my God. Yes. What is it?
Oh God, everything you own should be both beautiful and functional? Something? No, is it?
It's not functional, but yeah, it's that.
Yeah.
I think everything you own, William Morris says this, everything you own or have in your home should add, I guess, a sense of beauty or practicality. And I think it's just that. So a lot of, I think, what materials offer are memories. And I think if you're carrying memories with you in a nomadic life, then that is what adds value to you. And I think materials definitely create a sense of belonging. So whatever feels meaningful to you, you will carry with you, always. And I think more and more, we are kind of ending up in ways where I have multiple homes. You know, a little home in Nigeria, and then a little home in UK, and then there'll be something in India, and I think we're kind of living in spaces where I guess feeling like it's part of our lives and our worlds, and connecting with different places. So whatever allows me to be Indian in India will do that, and the same with Lagos, and then the same with London. And I think it's also about the cross-cultural nature of it as well. So, but I think a lot of people are trying to root themselves at the moment. I wouldn't say they're necessarily that nomadic anymore, but yeah, we went through a period of nomadism, but I think more and more people I find right now are trying to root themselves, and I think materials are definitely offering that rooting. And actually, I'm doing a project called Uprooted, about olive trees and how all these trees are being uprooted to facilitate a very high production rates of olive oil. And these trees are still alive, but they're being uprooted because they're not productive anymore. So it's the uprooting of agriculture, it's the uprooting of people, it's the uprooting of an industry, and it's the uprooting of materials, and also this person's practice who I'm designing with, called Jorge Peñades. So it's this idea of being uprooted and displaced and dispossessed in different areas is what I think is perhaps we're experiencing now, and I wouldn't call it nomadism, I would call it displacement.
Very interesting. Any other question from the audience? Yes, perfect.
Hello. Sorry, it's going to be a bit of a rambling question. I'll be trying to. It's for Georgina, actually. You spoke about. Well, there's a book I've got that's called The Qualitative Display of Quantitative Information. It's a really boring title. It's a really, really beautiful book. It's about systems and how we understand the world through graphics. And there's a map there that was done by Napoleon's cartographer, and it was basically Napoleon wanted to understand how he lost the Russian campaign, so he asked his cartographer to draw a diagram of both the time, the geography, and the tragedy, really, because actually every millimetre of every line he drew was 6,000 men. So he wanted to know, how did he lose his campaign? And it made me think, or your discussion made me think about time in that way. And I thought, you seem to be placing yourself in somewhere between kind of Marcel Proust and Philip Larkin in trying to understand what time is and how he experienced it. And I just wonder, are you kind of on a hiding to nowhere? Is time so massive now or so expansive that maybe we need to understand it graphically rather than in a literary way?
My short answer to that is no. My longer answer to meet your question. So to propose something which says this thing is so massive and so complex, we can only a graphic, a visual approach would be more necessary. Feels like it falls into the trap that we've always had for complexity. In the kind of longer history of systems, which comes out of at least longest history of longer history of systems in Northern Europe, that comes out of the Renaissance, that comes out of Galileo and of the mapping, star mapping essentially, and mapping of moons. There's been this relationship that's been set up in this idea of what a system is, that has implied that to be able to map it is to be able to know it. And somewhere down the line, you have this over the centuries, the context gets lost and all you're left with is the map. And with with all love to the graphic designers and the visual artists and the people who work in those spaces, absolutely, there is, doing this kind of visual representation work is hugely important. But it also only ever captures a fraction, and there is part one. Part two, there is always an intent, an aesthetic, and a politics designed into that, which I'm sure many people here are very acutely aware of how you are designing for an audience and designing for reception. So there is no neutrality in this. And point three, which actually comes back to the bees, so I will mention the bees now as well, is this imposition or this framing or this understanding of a graphical representation of something which imbues it with a kind of scientific authority. And with that scientific authority, it becomes a kind of, if not a mechanistic understanding, but an assumption that it is right, and it is accurate, and it is infallible, and it is unbiased. And for these kind of complexities, I think truly this is profoundly dangerous. It can assume there is almost not a simplicity, but if you can map, then you can control and then you can understand. Rather than having these things that are kind of looser tools that can crack open the kind of discussions and engagements and forms and mutualities that we've been talking about here. So of course, I use the subway map. When I'm in London, I look at, I figure out where I am from the tube. We have mapping systems all the time, but they are partial and they are complementary. And I think to think of something as time as something which is large and complex, but somehow universal in its large and complexities, rather than something which is nested and plural and has all the different times that I've mentioned, plus 1,000 different forms of times that I didn't. It takes away from those complexities and it flattens them down into something. And I feel that would be the opposite of the direction that we would like to that we should travel in, hopefully.
I have a follow-up on the question, actually. When you talk about the subway map, it's like a 2D, it's flattened completely. What would be your perfect vision of showing systems in complexity?
I don't think there is one. I mean, again, this kind of there is no singular visual approach which will capture something in its entirety, and there never can be. I think honestly the beauty of something like a subway map is that there are many of them. When I graduated my PhD, one of my PhD supervisors was well into trains. He loved trains. And I got him a book from one of the, from the London Transport Museum that had it was basically every map of every metro in the world. And he was incredibly happy about that. So we were all happy about that. But the point is there were loads of maps. And they worked differently and they did different things. And the London Underground map is very, very good. Like, let's not take away from that. But there are many others. And again, I think this idea of there being a perfect or a singular does damage to the kind of the nature of complexity of, you know, there are necessarily many ways to work with this, and there should be.
So we have a few more minutes, so I will pick very short questions for each of you coming from Slido, and then I will ask you 2 big questions. So, Seda, how long did the hotel project take, and how was it funded?
Great question. So, the hotel project took, for me, my part in it was 3 months. And the project itself was, I think, a year in total. And it was funded by the owner of the hotel called Ron Akili, who's Indonesian. So, yeah, he's independently funded.
Thank you. Sasha, can you tell us how we can source and grow the radioactivity soaking mushrooms? Apparently somebody wants dinner, I don't know.
Well, I have a good news for you. Probably they're living in your fridge. So I work with scientists in Slovenia who have the largest database of them in the world. It's just a life work of one incredible scientist called Nina Zimmerman. And they were very bored during COVID pandemic, so they sampled their flats all over, and they found them in fridges, in saunas, in all the wet places. They are there in very, of course, micro doses, but they're living with us forever.
That sounds like an invitation to meet us at the bar, you know, they have a lot of fridges in there. And Georgina, last question for you. Based on your experience with policymakers, what works best in truly making them listen?
Oh my gosh.
And don't say nothing.
I mean, maybe. I think, again, saying context is the weasel answer, but context matters so much. Understanding what is important to them, I think. I think when I was doing, and this is a long time ago now, but when I was doing policy work, people who are involved in policy, the policymakers, whether that's politicians or people in civil service, will often have very little time. There'll be separate agendas going on. There'll be a language, coming back to language, there'll be a language that they speak, there'll be a kind of a temporal rhythm that they're working in. There'll be incentives that they're working towards, whether it's either personally for the party or for the wider governance. Understanding what those are is point one, really. If you're coming in with a gigantic policy report, even the most beautiful narrative storytelling, and this person only has 5 minutes to listen to you, it goes nowhere. But understanding where that thing is and how you can kind of meet each other in that space and find something which is important within the context of how everything is happening is, I think, at least a starting point for it. This varies hugely by the level of policy that you're working at, the level of governance, and also what the ask is as well. But finding that common, like not even a common language, but like being able to communicate with each other, which in whatever form that will take, which will often come from knowledge of working with other people who have worked with them, has always felt like the most crucial thing.
Thank you. And last big question for all of you. The title of this conference is about future. We are all very futuristic here, but at the same time, our panel focused on travel. So if you could travel to the future, what would you do? What would you wish to learn? What would you wish to know? Anything. I'm giving unicorns and unlimited budgets just right now.
What if we don't want to travel to the future? I like it here, and it's very interesting, and I think there's so much to learn, and like travel from micro to macrocosmos here is quite amazing. So I would stay here.
I think very similar, and also just again to be a bit of difficult about this, there isn't a future, there are many, and like not to get all butterfly effect about it, because also that's not helpful, but which one and where and how. So I think with that in mind, I'm happy kind of roughly here at the moment. Maybe a future where there's lunch would be great, but you know, again, this is like a micro mundane future, which I really think we need to take seriously. I'm
going to be very basic. A future where there's more rest would be nice. But I'm in agreement with the two panelists as well. I think I don't really like to live my life in the future too much. I'm very much about the present, and that for me is quite a future already. So, yeah.
So let's travel together for lunch for the future. I respect the wishes of our panelists. We will meet here at 1:30 and we will continue with the last three presentations panel and the last presentation. Thanks a lot, you were amazing, and